Hello. Well, thank you very much to Michael Rebell and to President Furman and to everyone at the Campaign for Educational Equity. It's a real honor for me to be here among so many researchers and thinkers whose work on poverty and education I've read and followed and admired. My own journalistic investigation into the questions of poverty and education started a little more than 5 years ago, not far from here, when I first visited Jeffrey Canada in what was then the cramped headquarters of the Harlem Children's Zone on Park Avenue at 129th Street. Jeff's office on the second floor was about 20 yards from the elevated Metro North trains, and every few minutes a train full of commuters would rattle by, shaking the windows. But by the end of our first conversation, I knew that I wanted to write an article about Jeff's work, and by the time that article came out in the New York Times Magazine in 2004, I knew I wanted to go further and write a book. And so I spent the last 5 years reporting in Harlem, and at the same time, reading the growing body of relevant research, which spans psychology, sociology, neurology, and economics. In both my reporting and my research, I was struck by two powerful realities. The first one was that the obstacles poor children face are often huge and sometimes seem insurmountable. They seem that way to academics, to practitioners who work directly with poor people, and to poor people themselves. The gaps are wide and they're plentiful. Poor children hear fewer words at home than middle-class children do. They have less access to good health care. They move more frequently. They're more likely to be raised in a single-parent home. They're more likely to encounter violence, more likely to go into foster care, more likely to have a relative in prison, more likely to have teenage parents, more likely to have a parent suffering from high levels of stress or mental illness. They're less likely to have lots of educational toys and children's books, less likely to have a parent who graduated from college, less likely to be enrolled in high-quality childcare or preschool. And these multiple differences lead to an achievement gap that opens up very early. In her new book, Changing the Odds for Children at Risk, Susan Newman writes that on the first day of kindergarten, 80% of children at the highest socioeconomic level recognize the letters of the alphabet, and just 20% of children at the lowest socioeconomic level can do the same. The gaps are clear in the research, but for me, the fact of them didn't really hit home until I spent time talking to parents and children themselves and hearing their stories about life and poverty in Harlem. In the course of my reporting on the Harlem Children's Zone, I went through a 9-week parenting class called Baby College, along with 100 Harlem parents. And I met one mother there named Chantel Jones. She was 32 and she was pregnant with her 5th child. The first 4 had all been taken away from her by the city's Department of Child Services. She was poorly educated. She had only rudimentary reading skills. She'd never had a steady job. She'd lived in public housing all her life. She was often bewildered by encounters with authority. She argued with her obstetrician at Harlem Hospital and seemed convinced that he was trying to harm her unborn baby. She was still in love with the father of her child, but he was living with another woman and their children a few blocks away. Her unborn child, whom she had already named Treasure Lee, was due in a few months, and Treasure Lee faced every risk factor in the book. On paper, Treasure Lee, who is now a little more than a year old, is almost certain to fail, simply because of who her parents are and what neighborhood she lives in. Statistically, she's a good candidate for foster care, for substance abuse, for poor school performance, for becoming a dropout, for early pregnancy, for welfare, for prison. So the question is, what would it take for Treasure Lee to follow a very different path, to graduate from high school, to get through college, to postpone pregnancy till marriage, to stay away from drugs and stay out of trouble with the law, to have a stable family and a steady job, the basic elements of a successful middle-class life? Until recently, it seemed that it would take literally a miracle, that only 1 child out of 1,000 in Treasure Lee's circumstances might make it, and then only through some fluke combination of good genes and good fortune. The best that public policy could do for Treasure Lee, we believed, was to cushion some of the blows that she might face, to make it a bit more likely that she might turn out to be the lucky one to survive and to thrive. But things are changing. Until recently, the public policy debate was about what Chantel needed: job training, a husband, financial assistance, maybe a house in the suburbs. But now the debate is more often about what Treasure Lee needs. What kind of interventions in her life might provide her with the skills and abilities that would help her to succeed despite her harsh circumstances? There are still far too few examples of interventions that succeed with children like Treasure Lee. But they are out there, and the evidence for their success is growing. And that's the second powerful fact that I encountered in my reporting, that the many obstacles that face poor children can be overcome. Susan Newman, in her new book, profiles 9 successful interventions, all outside of schools, from around the country. She includes the Nurse-Family Partnership, which sends trained nurses to visit and counsel poor mothers during and after their pregnancies. Early Head Start offers low-income families parental support, medical care, and daycare centers during the first 3 years of the lives of their children. She writes about Avance, a 9-month language enrichment program for Spanish-speaking parents, mostly immigrants from Mexico, that operates in Texas and Los Angeles. And there's also Bright Beginnings, a pre-K program in the Charlotte Regional School District in North Carolina that enrolls 4-year-olds who score the lowest on a screening test of cognitive ability and manages to bring most of them up to grade level by the first day of kindergarten. From her research, Newman has identified certain characteristics of successful non-school interventions. They start early. They aren't universal. Instead, they focus on the families that need them the most. They provide intensive and comprehensive support. They use well-trained staff. They focus on one ultimate goal, boosting academic achievement, and they hold themselves accountable for the outcomes they produce. At the same time that we've been learning about these out-of-school interventions, evidence has also been building around certain in-school practices that produce promising results with low-income students. The most dramatic success stories in recent years have come from charter schools. Schools like the ones run by KIPP, Achievement First, and Uncommon Schools all target poor minority children, and they've shown remarkable and consistent success at bringing those children to high levels of achievement in a relatively short period of time. These successful schools are generally run according to a common set of principles. First, that disadvantaged students need many extra hours in the classroom in order to catch up with middle-class students. So the schools operate on an extended day and an extended year. Second, that the best teachers should be teaching the most challenging students. And third, that in order to succeed in a challenging neighborhood, and especially with poorly educated kids entering middle school, you need to give constant attention to building the culture of your school, as well as what many charter school leaders call the character of their students, which is another word for what the economist James Heckman calls non-cognitive skills: motivation, discipline, self-confidence, ambition. The problem right now with both these educational and non-educational successes is that they are isolated and scattered across the country, and they're usually directed at only a few years of a child's life, which means that their positive effects tend to fade once the intervention ends. After students leave the Bright Beginnings pre-kindergarten in Charlotte, North Carolina, and enter the regular public school system, their impressive results decline year after year. And after students graduate from a KIPP or Achievement First middle school, they often struggle in high school, even when they achieved great results in middle school. And this is exactly why I think that the Harlem Children's Zone is such an important model. It is neither isolated nor scattered. Instead, it is a comprehensive set of integrated educational and social programs that follow disadvantaged children in a 97-block neighborhood in Harlem from cradle to college. It combines an intensive, no-excuses charter school with what Jeffrey Canada calls a conveyor belt of social programs, designed to mimic the often invisible cocoon of support and nurturance that follows middle-class and upper-middle-class kids throughout their childhoods. The conveyor belt begins with Baby College, the parenting program where I met Chantel Jones. Baby College works with 500 or 600 parents a year, encouraging them to choose alternatives to corporal punishment and to read and talk more with their children. The next step on the conveyor belt is the 3-year-old journey, which is sort of like the graduate school version of Baby College. And there, parents are given more sophisticated strategies for boosting the vocabularies and other cognitive abilities of their children. Children proceed directly from the 3-year-old journey into an all-day language-focused pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds, and then directly to Promise Academy, a K-12 charter school that runs on an extended day and an extended year, and where teachers and principals have pledged to get every child to college. Along the way, children on the conveyor belt have continuous access to community supports like family counseling, after-school tutoring, and a health clinic. The goal, in the end, is to produce children with the abilities and the character to survive adolescence in a high-poverty neighborhood, to make it to college, and to graduate. From my reporting and my research, and from the data emerging from the Promise Academy Elementary School, I think that the Harlem Children's Zone is a program that could serve as a model for cities across the country. And I'm not alone in this. In the summer of 2007, Barack Obama, who was then an unlikely and unusual presidential candidate, gave a speech in which he pledged, if elected, to replicate the zone in 20 neighborhoods in 20 American cities. He proposed that these replication projects, he calls them promised neighborhoods, would be run as 50-50 partnerships between the federal government and local companies, governments, and philanthropies. And he pledged a few $1 billion to cover the federal share of that cost. Until the Iowa caucuses, that pledge seemed like nothing more than an interesting footnote to the growth of the Harlem Children's Zone. Now, needless to say, Obama's proposal has become considerably more significant. As president, Obama may have a few other problems that he needs to deal with before he can turn to replicating the Harlem Children's Zone. You know, saving capitalism, bringing peace to the Middle East, averting a depression. But already, his election has transformed this proposal from an interesting thought experiment to the official policy of the president-elect. And that means we all have an opportunity, and I would argue even a responsibility, to figure out how we can help make that promise a reality and a successful one. The most thoughtful analysis that I've read yet of what it might take to move from a single local model to a national program is a new report by Lizbeth Shore, a researcher at Harvard, who is the author of the influential public policy book Within Our Reach. Her new report is titled Scaling Up What Works to Fight Urban Poverty, and its main message is that scaling up programs like the Harlem Children's Zone, or the Nurse-Family Partnership, which Obama has also pledged to replicate and expand, is possible, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to take creative thinking about leadership, about data, and about bureaucracy. Shore points out that a plan like Obama's would mean a huge new public investment, as well as untold new risks. But, she writes, that investment is worth making, and the risks are worth taking, only because efforts like the Harlem Children's Zone carry the potential of bringing about greater and more profound change and long-term economic benefits than does the replication of any single program. They carry the potential of changing outcomes not just for individual children and families, but for whole populations in devastated neighborhoods, and therefore, for the nation. If we can get the details right, Obama's promised neighborhoods could have a revolutionary effect on the way that we think about poverty in this country. For one, they would challenge the traditional division between education policy and poverty policy, between schools and everything else. Geoffrey Canada's argument, and I think it's Obama's argument as well, is that the divide in public discourse between school and non-school no longer makes sense. If we try to fix the schools in a low-income neighborhood without addressing the other needs of students there, it's not a real solution to the neighborhood's problems. And likewise, it isn't enough to provide social services to poor children if their neighborhood schools are still giving them a lousy education. A true solution to the problem of underachievement in inner-city public schools is going to require more nurturing families and safer neighborhoods, as well as better teachers and more accountable schools. It's not only possible to fix both problems at the same time, it's essential. Thank you.